This is Dangerous Driving, and if it wasn't already clear, it's a spiritual successor to the Burnout series developed by some of its original creators. With a focus on track-based driving, takedowns, boost chains, and insane speeds, it's also exhilarating to play, but just how well does it actually run? Today, we're going to examine performance and visual quality across every console while discussing just how close it comes to matching the Burnout series. And to discuss it, I am joined by the one and only Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, how's it all going there?
Not bad, not bad. I think we've both spent a little time playing around here with Dangerous Driving and have some first impressions to give on this game. And I was pretty excited to check this out as a huge fan of the old Burnout series. And right from the get-go, it's pretty clear that this is trying to evoke those feelings.
Yeah, definitely. Specifically Burnout 3. I think they've kind of targeted that as the purest Burnout experience that they're kind of looking to replicate on the current generation machines. And it's a fascinating one because essentially we have a developer which has, I think, 7 members only, looking to produce, as you say, a spiritual sequel to a game that was, bankrolled with a huge development team for its time, and essentially had far fewer budgetary issues than Three Fields have hit.
Yeah, that's the challenge, because Burnout 3 was their third game. Criterion had grown, EA was bankrolling it. It was a big AAA game, absolutely packed with content. And while Dangerous Driving is definitely a lovely looking game, it's clear that obviously the budget and manpower just wasn't comparable. It's most evident in things like some of the menus and the transitions, and also the lack of any sort of complex urban tracks. But still, what's here is really good. So, I think the first thing we really need to talk about before we get into more details of the game is really what everybody probably wants to know. Performance. The Burnout series built itself on frame rate. 60 frames per second was always the target for the series, starting with Burnout 1. And Criterion stuck to that through the entire series, on console at least, until they went to Need for Speed. So I guess that's where we should start.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting one, obviously, because you're quite right. The original Burnout games were all running at 60 frames per second, but then they shifted to Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, which was 30 frames per second. So, and it was, very, very close to a Burnout-style experience, but at half the frame rate. With Dangerous Driving, what we have is the base consoles targeting 30 frames per second, while the enhanced consoles, PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X, target 60 frames per second. So, side by side, there's no competition really. You want to be playing the game on the enhanced machines there. But going into this one, I was curious to the extent that they could actually lock to 60 frames per second, because Danger Zone 2 on Xbox One X, that had a 60 frames per second mode, but it did have noticeable drops. So, I was kind of going into this one hopeful that the performance level could be considerably improved, a lot more consistent there, and, well, they've done it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised and impressed. I mean, it's basically a locked 60 frames per second.
Yeah.
Well, specifically on PS4 Pro, here it's just about perfect, I think, and it feels even more stable than the older Burnout games. But Xbox One X, while similarly close, has a few more issues that you don't get on the Pro. Like, there's these tiny blips that seem to occur when certain text appears on screen, and there's also other sections, like during this race I ran into, where the frame rate actually dips below 60 FPS. It's not a massive drop necessarily, but I definitely felt it when it happened. So in that sense, the Pro does have an advantage here over the X. But by and large, they both do hold 60 frames per second most of the time, which is on par and actually slightly superior to the old Burnout games, where they would actually drop some frames during crashes and whatnot. So it is actually very, very smooth, provided you're playing on Xbox One X or the PS4 Pro.
Definitely, yeah. And I think the thing that kind of struck me was that it's so smooth, it's so close to that 60 frames per second lock, that when those blips happen, when that text appears on screen, it does seem to be linked to the arrival of these like 2D bitmaps. you do actually feel that kind of slight jump, that slight stutter. It's the only blemish that I could find on the games. Not really a big deal, but it is a tiny little niggle there.
Yeah, I mean, that's right for the most part, except for those occasional sections like we saw on the Xbox One X, where you get those little dips below 60. But again, that's pretty rare, thankfully. But for the absolute smoothest experience, you definitely want to play it on the Pro. But still, it's impressive just because I don't think there's a lot of games in this style running on Unreal Engine 4 targeting frame rates like this on the consoles. And you can kind of see some of the sacrifices made. I mean, the track design isn't... they're often beautiful, but relatively simple. Like, I think actually, in a way, it reminds me more of Burnout 1 or Burnout 2, actually, where it's very countryside-driven, lots of, rolling hills and trees, not a lot of dense urban environments like you often saw in Burnout 3, although there was kind of a healthy mix there. But still, it looks great running at a high frame rate. The motion blur is excellent. For me at least, I love it. It looks great. But yeah, beyond performance then, I suppose the other main difference really comes down to resolution, in which case it's 1440p over on Xbox One X and just 1080p on the Pro, but in both cases, the anti-aliasing is extremely good. I assume they're using Unreal's temporal anti-aliasing in there, but however, whatever's being used, it's extremely clean around the edges. There's not a lot of noise and artifacts happening. There's a lot of screen space reflections too, which look really nice in this game. So yeah, it's smooth, it's clean, and it runs well on those consoles.
Definitely, but on the base machines, I kind of went straight from the Xbox One X to the S, and the drop to 30 frames per second isn't the same as back in the day when they dropped to 30 on Need for Speed. I mean, that was perfectly consistent 30, good frame pacing. Here we have a similar issue to what we've seen on prior titles from Three Fields, which is that the frame delivery isn't consistent, and that kind of has an impact on the fluidity of the experience.
Yeah, bad frame pacing again. It is exactly that issue where it's still averaging out to 30 frames per second, but the frames persist for variable lengths of time, basically bounce between 16, 33, or 50 millisecond windows. And thinking of that, one thing we still need to try is the 120 hertz mode on Xbox One S, just to see how that fares. I suspect it won't make a difference in this case, since it's still capped at 30, but you never know. But yeah, and it is the same story on the base PS4 as well, where they are both locked at 30, but with very inconsistent frame pacing. It is highly reminiscent of a From Software game, so if you played Bloodborne or Sekiro recently, it's pretty much like that. But the problem is that this is a very fast-paced driving game, and when you're already having the frame rate from 60 and introducing those errors, it just doesn't feel smooth enough. So in that sense, I definitely felt that it was much, much more enjoyable to play on the Pro and Xbox One X.
Yeah, I agree entirely. It's quite jarring to move between one and the other. And that's kind of a shame, because a lot of the mechanics of the game are just absolutely spot on here. The handling, the drifting.
Yeah, it does feel quite good. And maybe the feeling of weight in the cars kind of strikes me as kind of in between the earlier Burnouts and Burnout 3 maybe. But it is very reminiscent of those games, and they successfully replicated that feel of quickly drifting around a corner while boosting, and then, side swiping guys and sending them into the railing. That's all there. The takedown camera's there, and it's optional if you don't like that. And, it does feel great in that regard. I will say that the crashes themselves are not as spectacular as I might have liked, and I can kind of understand why, I suppose. I mean, Burnout Paradise, you still look at today, and the crumpling metal and the way those cars break apart, it still looks great. And I don't feel that they've quite matched that here, but it is, it still works in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, when I play the game, it's it's a throwback experience. It tries to take you back to that Burnout 3 era, that kind of magic that you had at the time. And it's funny that a lot of it really stands up in terms of comparisons with a modern game. But yeah, when you look at stuff like the physics, particularly on crashes, it just goes to show how far we've come. So it's almost like a kind of, there are quite a lot of indie games that are sort of modern spins on a retro theme, and that's kind of what I felt going into this one.
Yeah, exactly. And, I'm a big fan of arcade racing games in general, so which is why I'm so big on games like, last year's Onrush. I love this game as well so far. I just appreciate the fast pick up and play arcade style racing that they offer. But there are a couple other flaws though that I did pick up on during the initial play that did disappoint a little, and one of them is the soundtrack. So they've taken an interesting approach here in that they've integrated, I guess, Spotify into the game. So if you have a Spotify account, you just log in with it and you have your music. And I guess on Xbox One you might be able to use the custom media player at the OS level to play your own music as well. But if you don't have that, there is no music. Outside of one main menu song, there is absolutely no music at all, which that's one of those things I feel a racing game really needs, and I'm a little disappointed that they didn't find another way, and even if you wanted to use your own music, I still appreciate when a racing game has its own special crafted soundtrack, something that fits the action. I think that's really important, and that's the one area that it's kind of a letdown for me.
The classic case in point would be the Ridge Racer series.
Oh yeah, Ridge Racer, absolute. You take away the music from Ridge Racer, it absolutely destroys the experience in a way. I mean, they're still great, but they depend so much on the soundscape, and that is just not here at all in that sense, and that is disappointing. And then there's also the loading screens, which I did actually check it out, and they're very comparable to, say, Burnout 3 on PlayStation 2. But they're very static, and the lack of any sort of transitional or music, it does feel a little bit stark, jumping between the main menu, load, and then the car screen, and it's not optimal, but it's also not like Anthem here or anything, so it's not that problematic really. But it is something you would notice. I do appreciate though how they the loading screen text is reminiscent of exactly the same types of loading screens you would see in Burnout 3. Or this sort of, have you tried this track, or have you driven this car? And that's a neat little touch. I thought that was fun.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one here, how just, it is such a throwback to Burnout 3. But, yeah, I see what you mean about the loading, and I actually think a point you raised earlier, which is that the fact that there is no audio in terms of, there's no audio at all in terms of the loading, is there? That kind of has a real impact on how long it feels that you're loading the game, the fact
exactly.
And you've got static screens here that aren't actually doing much. So again, it just kind of, there's nothing to distract you. You are literally waiting with no form of entertainment. And
exactly.
I think that's kind of the issue there. Even though the loading isn't really so bad at all,
no, it's
just
not.
the fact that it's just nothing is going on at that point. There is no distraction whatsoever. But I'm hopeful that, I don't know. I think that the direction that Three Fields are going here, which is that basically they want the user to define their own soundtrack. So I'm not sure what's actually going to happen there, whether it will improve, but. If you don't have Spotify Premium, which I don't and which you don't, then, essentially, from my perspective, the best I can do is, ask Alexa to come up with something. And, yeah, that's maybe that's some kind of integration they could add in as well. But I don't know, that's kind of, it kind of just adds to the feel that, it's almost like a work in progress and not quite finished.
Yeah, it does kind of have that feeling, regrettably, where the solid game, where the base mechanics are there, it's very solid, it feels fun, the track design is solid, but there's just all those little elements around it that don't feel entirely finished. And it does feel even, it just doesn't quite have the polish of even something like Dangerous Golf, which I thought was pretty slick. It just, if they could just work out those elements a little bit smoother, it would kind of, it would complete the package. But it's again, and it's in. We don't look at too many of these small indie titles that much, and I do understand the struggle of making this kind of project when you're a small team like that and you're working, in a limited capacity. You're trying to simulate or emulate even something that you worked on, but had done so with a very large team and a large budget. That they've come this close is commendable and impressive.
Yeah, I think the handling mechanic is just, boost drift. I think we talked about that earlier. It's just awesome. It really feels perfect. And
that's key.
Yeah, the takedown mechanic, it really does take you all the way back to Burnout 3. It really does feel just right. And the ways in which you can take the opponents down as well. You are transported back, and the old techniques that you used at the time, they all seem to work just fine. So I don't know whether it's just kind of like nostalgia or whatever, but it really does feel the part. So yeah, I think in terms of the enhanced consoles, and there's a PC version coming as well, which I would hope would be fairly easy to lock to 60 frames per second. So, for the most part, I think a lot of owners are going to have a lot of fun with this. And I think the other thing we should speak about is the developmental process, because if we go back to Danger Zone 2, this was 3 fields essentially doing a lot of the groundwork for the game that we've got today. So, the crashes, the cars, the idea of being able to generate circuits. They've never done that before. All of that groundwork was laid in Danger Zone 2. And then it was expanded upon, and I guess 9 months, 10 months, whatever later, we've got Dangerous Driving. So I guess from my perspective, I'm kind of curious to see what comes next.
Yeah, me too. And I hope that this is successful enough to allow them to continue, because you can see that there's a lot of passion there, and you can definitely see the good stuff coming through here. It's a very solid racing game, and I think I kind of compared this. I suggested this is like. To me, it feels like Burnout 1 viewed through the lens of Burnout 3, where it's like, okay, we're just getting started with this. Here's our ideas. Let's iterate, essentially. You know what I mean? Where it's like you can see that they're building back to something great, and I hope it finds success, because there's just not enough arcade racing games these days.
Sure, and I think the last big example was Onrush, which really didn't, it was kind of like a sort of AA title which just didn't find an audience, and that was such a shame, because it was an awesome game.
It really was. It was a lot of fun, and it just didn't get that audience. And it was a different kind of game. It had some unique ideas, but it didn't work out, and that is a shame. And I don't know. I really hope that somehow this style of game can kind of start to return. I'm still holding out hope that Namco's secretly working on a Ridge Racer game back there, but we'll see.
But this is the game that many people wanted for a long time, and that what I think they kind of thought 3 Fields would be doing to begin with, which is to take their classic franchise and kind of revitalize it, since Electronic Arts just don't seem to have that much passion for the franchise or interest in it. So I, for one, really appreciate that it's here. And as I said, so many of the fundamentals are just bang on, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how this one evolves. Hopefully we'll see multiplayer at some point as well.
Yeah, that would be great, absolutely. Maybe even split screen, though that might be taxing the base consoles a little much.
Right.
But I think that's pretty much all we have to say on this for now, so thanks for joining me to chat about it.
No problem.
And if you did enjoy this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell up there, because it is very helpful for the channel, and follow us over on Twitter if you want to chat about Burnout, Dangerous Driving, or any other thing, honestly. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.